Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and you can see I've got a couple things out here on the bench. It's an empty bus bin. It's one of the larger size ones that I've got, as well as a couple little pieces of paper over here that we're going to talk about momentarily. It's been 14 days now since we last checked in on our yellow buckets, and these yellow buckets are now over 290 days of age. I think 292 is their age. And over that course of time, they've been fed over 20 times, I believe 21 times. Maybe even 22, I can't remember now. But in my wormery, it's always kind of been, I don't know, 150 always seemed like the amount of time I would normally want to let a bin go. So well before that, I would normally try to start, coercing the worms out of their material, either by giving them something really tempting to move into or be lured over to, and usually at the same time trying to let the material that they're residing in air dry and maybe become a little bit less damp, a little bit less comfortable for them to be in, inspiring them to move over into the feeding area, into ultimately the collection area. Something that I usually refer to as the horizontal migration feeding zone, since in essence you're trying to migrate the worms through the material that they're in over into that feeding area. And in containers like these buckets, it's awfully hard to do that. It's very difficult to work inside those things. You're reaching down probably about a foot before you even reach the material, let alone needing to get down into the material and do things. So I think it's always been pretty clear that at some point it would be necessary to empty those containers into a more practical container in which work can actually be done. So today they're finally going to get moved out of there. All the material that they're in, all the castings, it's mostly castings at this point. They got fed 14 days ago. The stuff they were fed would have been, minute granular bits of maybe coffee and worm chow. And once we get the material over into this container here, I think we'll be able to manage it a little bit better. So I just wanted to touch briefly on this little illustration I've got here. It's really a printout of one of my spreadsheets that I created once to try to figure out, if I was emptying one of my my worm bags outside, how much volume of material sits in that thing based on its diameter and depth versus the capacity of one of my larger bus bins, this size right here. And then later I felt like what I was more interested in was understanding the amount of material sitting within these yellow buckets that I've got, in order to figure out, if I triple that, how much volume of material am I talking about, and will it fit into this container here? And I think that the numbers add up to something that suggests that I could probably, might see these little markings here on this envelope here. I marked where 5 inches is here to show that if I pile material into here 5 inches deep, then how much space does that require? And according to this, it should work. I don't want to get into the numbers, but I think you get what I'm talking about. So I think the next step is going to be to get those buckets over here, empty the material into this container, and then all I want to do is set up a horizontal migration to try to get the worms to move out. So I'm not sure how much of this I want to film, just in case I get awkward and end up spilling stuff. I don't know, we'll see. I'm going to play it by ear, but I'm going to get stuff up here, begin the process of emptying material into this container, and then at some point at the end we're just going to set up a horizontal migration so we can start luring the worms out of the material that they reside in. So I'm going to get a glove on and we're going to get to work. Up here on the bench we've already got bucket number 1 of 3 ready to go, and I just peeked down into the system and I noticed something that I figured I would try to pull out of the container carefully without dumping it over. Oops. Well, I guess I'm already starting to drop some stuff here, but I think what I saw, I don't know, maybe I was just imagining, but it does seem to me like a couple of the things that the worms have left out here on top of this piece of cardboard, besides a few of their castings, are a couple cocoons. And I'm not sure if cocoons are able to just dry out like this and still be viable. But I'm just gonna, keep it. What else am I gonna do with it? And, oh, this looks like that little piece of paper that had been used within the system. It had been a coffee filter, and it was marking where we had last fed. So I guess what I'm after is, you know, once I lure the worms out of the material, is just a container full of castings only. So I don't want to have little scraps of what had been their feeding zone indicator in here, or anything for that matter. So if we see any larger chunks of cardboard or anything else like that, I think we can just pull it out. So let's see if we can simply jostle this material out of the bucket and try not to leave any worms behind. I guess the material at the bottom is a little bit more damp than I expected it to be. There's a good number of worms hanging out down within that. So I think I'm going to have to reach down and dislodge some of this material from the bottom of the bucket to help it all drop out. Luckily that went pretty smoothly. I feel like I should probably knock on wood so as not to jinx myself, because I, after all, do have 2 more of these that I need to take care of emptying. Now, once upon a time, when I took all of these worms that are in these 3 buckets out of the system that they all lived in together previously, I had estimated that I had hauled out about 1,200 worms. Regrettably, that was not one of the situations where I got the input of the viewers on how many worms there had been. In that particular case, I had simply taken a simple estimate on my own of how many worms I thought occupied the system, and then I just took it 3 ways. I took that 1,200 and divided that number 3 ways to come up with an initial estimated start population of 400 per bucket. And I guess we can maybe try to move the material around a little bit, check it out. This is the first time in almost 300 days that we've had a chance to really see this stuff spread out in front of us. There appear to be worms pretty much everywhere. A lot of them are little babies. And I think that's one thing that we did observe pretty regularly in here was cocoons, and naturally that is followed by baby worms. I just thought I would try to go through here and see if there's anything that might appear to be clumping up, or anything that would appear to be problematic, or any sort of residue or debris within the material that would be easier to pluck out now while it's still relatively shallow. So I mean, here for example appears to be like a chunk of wood or something, which I guess at some point might just get screened out if we decide to screen these castings in the end. Sometimes I don't bother. Sometimes I just figure, you know, hey, what the heck, there's really nothing to screen out of this stuff. As long as all the worms have moved out, it's pretty much castings only. And anything in here that's not castings is just going to go through the screen along with the castings anyway, since it's all tiny particle matter. And yeah, lots of little baby worms hanging out in here with the adults, it seems. And I don't know if it's coming up on the camera, but I do also see a good number of cocoons in the material too, just as I glance down into here and look around. So that was pretty painless, I must say. And it does appear to me that emptying 2 more buckets with a similar amount of material should probably still keep us at a pretty decent level. So I think I'm going to go ahead and grab bucket number 2, and we're going to proceed to emptying that one into here as well. Here too, I think I saw maybe 1 cocoon out on top of this piece of cardboard. And just in case it's still gonna yield baby worms, I figured I would just keep it here with the rest of the material. So let's see how we do emptying bucket number 2. These things have been maintained pretty much identically to each other in terms of the amount of food they've been given, the amount of worms that we believe we started each system with. So I don't really expect to see too many deviations as we get into buckets number 2 and 3. Here too, I'm assuming I'm going to have to do a little bit of scraping to dislodge the more damp stuff that has adhered to the bottom of the bucket here. And it appears to be roughly the same amount of stuff that got stuck to the bottom. And I still see a couple more worms still residing in this stuff. Oops. Okay. If I leave a little bit of casting material behind, that's not too much of a problem. I'm just more worried about leaving behind worms. So if the castings dry out a little bit, and if I return those dry castings to the remainder of this to this collection of material later, even if after it's dry, I don't think it's too much of a problem, or dried out a little bit, but I just really don't want to expose any unfortunate wormies to exceedingly dry conditions that might not be healthy for them. So let's check out how the material and the worms from bucket number 2 look. Here too, some sort of a tough shell of something, maybe a, I don't know, shell of a avocado or something. Castings are really nice. Relatively few pieces of material or debris littering it. I'm usually pretty careful about the types of things I put into all my worm bins, so I usually don't have to pick out too many scraps of things that are garbage. And you know, little things like this are going to easily get broken down, I believe, just based on the number of worms that are in here and the fact that there is going to be a little bit more time for them to kind of hang out in this stuff and eventually work their way out of it. I believe that these thin strands here might be from some of the bedding that I use, because I usually don't worry too much nowadays about grinding up Amazon boxes that have that tape on them with the reinforcing strands in it. I assume that that material will all break down as well, based on what I've heard from other worm farmers and their experiences. So yeah, things look really nice in here. Another piece of what appears to be avocado shell. And it certainly seems to me like getting a third bucket's worth of material in here should be certainly no problem at all. It will bring us up pretty high, and then since we are going to have to allocate a section of this bin for the horizontal migration feeding zone, as we nudge everything over, it will increase the overall depth of the contents here, but I still think we're going to be in pretty good shape. This to me looks like maybe a little chunk of plastic that snuck into my shredder and into my pre-made bedding material, but gladly I don't see a great deal of that. If I bump into that sort of stuff, I'll typically try to pull it out. I'm usually not looking for it, but in a system like this where almost everything is castings anymore, to see anything like that remaining is pretty obvious. It just sort of sticks right out. Yeah, all right, let's get that third bucket in here, and finally we'll be free of our yellow buckets. Okay, on here I don't see any cocoons, I don't think, or maybe that's one right there. Kind of tough to tell, but I'm pretty sure a cocoon requires dampness and moisture in order for the little wormies that are in it to survive. I mean, if the thing dries out, it's hard to imagine that any worms in it would be able to live through that drying. So I think I don't know, I was just curious if there were possibly any worms hanging out within the layers of this cardboard, but the cardboard is quite dry, and I doubt that they would have gone in there considering the lack of moisture. So let's get the third one emptied out. And man, what a nice batch of castings. I do kind of treat this as just a single batch, not as 3 separate batches in a way, because this whole thing has always been handled as just a single unit. You know, at no point did I ever do anything with just one of these buckets. I've always handled them as a matched set, which always got equal maintenance every step of the way. So good bit of worms coming out of here. Ooh, a lot of them at the bottom of this one. I wonder if this one might have just been starting to get a little bit drier, causing the worms to want to dive to the bottom where the moisture is best preserved and in the greatest amounts. I'm seeing more cocoons here and there. Lots of worms still in here. I'm gonna have to be careful to make sure I don't leave any behind. So I might take a little break after we've emptied bucket number 3 here, just to make sure I go through all 3 buckets carefully to make sure no one's been left behind. And then I'll feel like we're doing things properly here and not condemning any poor little left behind wormies to drying out in their yellow bucket. I guess the other option would be for me to simply go outside and rinse these off with the garden hose, and then any worms that do end up still in here and getting rinsed out that way will just end up as freed worms living in the great outdoors. Although with winter right around the corner and freezing temperatures probably arriving soon, I'm not sure if it's the best thing for worms. Staying indoors here in my wormery is probably the best bet for any of these little wormies. Here's a chunk of material, a little bit more clumpy than I would have expected. Nothing like we've seen before, and just the general look of this material appears pretty damp too. Like here too, I could see a cocoon resting in that little pile of material. I'm not sure if you saw it before I dropped it. So one more time, I'm just going to kind of comb through this stuff a bit with my fingertips to see if I could spot anything larger. This to me looks like maybe what's left of a little bit of a banana stem or something. It's certainly not a lot of food, and it's certainly not the size of a typical banana stem, but it's just got that sort of shape to it, and once you break it down, it's got all the little strands to it. So I'm pretty sure that that's what that was. Alright, very nice. Very nice indeed. And I don't know, I'm pretty certain that we're well in excess of 1,200 worms here. Meaning, you know, we're probably well beyond just 400 plus 400 plus 400. I'm not sure you can see, but this little thing over here in the middle, which appears to be a knot, like somebody tied these 2 worms together in a knot. That's just the way the worms connect up to one another when they're mating. So that's always a really good thing to observe, I think, when you're in your worm bins, to see 2 worms latched onto one another doing the deed. You know you got baby worms on your way in the near future. So I must have fed avocado, and I must have just not given it enough time to break down. But it does seem like the amount of it is limited. Here and there I bump into a piece, and I just assume that maybe the reason it got left over is uneaten, because maybe it was just resting up against the side of the container and just didn't really get the type of worm traffic that would have normally resulted in it getting broken down, or whatever the case may be. So yeah, I think we've got lots and lots of worms in here. Yeah, I'm not really looking for estimates quite yet, you know. I'm sure a lot of people are going to start throwing numbers out there like, dude, you've probably got X thousand worms or whatever. And that'll be all interesting, but I'm not going to be looking to record that information quite yet. At some point when we do round the worms up into a horizontal migration feeding zone and begin into the haul out of those worms from the material that they used to live in, then I think we'll have a much better view of how many we've got, and a much easier shot at actually coming up with a good estimate of how many we've got in here. So I'm still just kind of combing through the material here to see if I bump into any other large chunks of anything, be it leftover debris or just clumped up worm bin material that I'd prefer to see kind of broken up and be loose. And then I'll have that sense that pretty much everything in here is just more or less loose, granular castings with very little of anything else mixed in. It does seem like the only things I really came across were little bits of what appears to be avocado shell. And, you know, that stuff doesn't need to go in the trash. I could just toss that into maybe the feeding zone of this system when we reset here. But I do feel like we've come up a little bit higher within this container than I predicted we would, which is not a problem. That's the reason I really only wanted to calculate up to 5 inches of depth, just in case I miscalculated or, you know, was a little bit shy on my estimate in terms of how much material we were dealing with in these 3 buckets. But I think at this point, it's time for me to take these buckets outside, give them a good rinse, make sure any worms left behind within them are not going to get stuck and dry. They're just going to be set free outside, and I'm not sure how many there will be. I'm sure we did a pretty good job emptying these buckets, so I think it's break time for me. But when I come back, it's going to be time to set up the horizontal migration of the worms out of their material that they reside in. All right, let's grab these buckets and head on outside. Well, I think I've gotten all the little worms that were in the material out, and some of them ended up in one of my fabric bags that I've got a, what kind of plant is that? It's a horseradish plant growing, and some of them probably just got spilled right out onto my lawn on my backyard. But the buckets are now empty, still need to be washed and cleaned, but any worms that might have been left behind in them have been removed. So I am going to have to take another quick break now because I don't have the food that would be needed to set up a horizontal migration feeding zone yet. So it's break time once again while I get set up for the next stage of this. So we'll be back momentarily when I'm ready to continue. Well, those of you who are regulars on my channel know what I'm doing here. This is one of my little fancy dividing walls, and it's really not obviously trying to divide anything from anything other than prevent my nice castings from getting contaminated by any sort of bedding that we're going to use in the horizontal migration feeding zone. And then another thing that I like to do sometimes is use a couple of these cardboard tubes as little standoffs just to help me when I'm setting the thing up, you know, keep things kind of level until I've had a chance to backfill. So before we can place in our little dividing wall and establish our feeding zone, we're going to have to move a lot of this material over. Oh yeah, I've also, you know, I salvaged what seemed to be the most sturdy of these coverings, but what remains are over here, and I think we'll just use these spread out across the top as sort of loose top coverings. As much as I want to see the worms move out, I also want to allow enough moisture to remain in this material for long enough that all these cocoons have a chance to hatch, and that the babies can, you know, go along for the exit of the material as well. So, you know, since cocoons usually take a certain amount of time to hatch, 3-4 weeks, whatever the case may be, I've got a feeling we're going to be allowing this to go for a little while at least. I mean, at some point I think we're going to have a good number of worms over here in this material, and we're probably going to arrange getting them out of the material over the course of a couple haul outs. And then towards the very end, we'll eventually also have the babies catching up with the rest of the crowd, and they'll get hauled out with all the rest, pretty much leaving this material as worm-free castings, and then it'll be ready for use in the garden or whatever the case may be. And I guess since we're, approaching winter time here anyway, I'm not planning on doing any sort of winter crops or anything of that sort. So my need for castings is not going to really start kicking in again until springtime, many months from now. So I think, even though I don't want to leave the system with a big huge mound in the middle that goes over the top of the rim of the container, I am going to pile it a little bit higher here right in the beginning, just so I can open up enough space here to create the feeding zone. And I am a little bit limited on space. You can see the stuff avalanching back down into the hole, and all the worms squirming within the material doesn't help that much either. So I'm going to go slow. I don't want to end up with stuff all over the table and the floor. I don't think we've got to go too overboard in terms of making a huge migration zone, but I would like to make it big enough so that we could fit those cardboard standoff tubes in. And it would be nice to make sure we've gotten all these nice castings to the one side of the dividing wall, or the partition wall, I guess. I don't want to divide anything, like I said earlier. I just want to keep the castings from getting any of my shredded paper or any of that sort of stuff in it. So now I'm going to just try to get a sense of how I did in terms of making ourselves a large enough space here to get the job done. I think that should work, right? And I think maybe I'll just put this one in the middle as sort of an extra support. Maybe these going to the outside might be the smarter way to play it. I don't want to backfill too much yet. I just want to get enough so that it's sort of propped up nicely, enabling me to come in here with my fresh bedding supply and start building this out. I have not even bought down any food with which we're going to set up this feeding area. So I will have to take yet another break momentarily once we put a little bit of foundation into here, so I can get some yummy food to pile in here too. Now I just took some pieces of newspaper that I thought we would simply crumble up. Some of this paper I find a little bit questionable. Some of the ink on it seems to be a little bit glossier than it needs to be. Hopefully it's all stuff that the worms were able to break down pretty nicely over time. But I'm not too worried about it. They usually do quite a nice job, despite any sort of concerns or trepidations I have from time to time. They always seem to exceed my expectations. Okay, I'm just sort of trying to come up with a good spacing on this stuff so it's more or less at a nice level for us to start coming in here with some food items. And now might be the time for me to take a break to get us some food for these little guys. Look at this guy, he's anxious to get right over into the collection area already. Don't worry, buddy, you'll have time. I'm just wondering where we're going to be left once we backfill here. I think we'll be all right as far as being at least below the rim of the container. That's where I'd like to be with this. So let me take another short break. I'm going to go get foods that we can build up this feeding area with. And I'm also getting my shredded paper prepared bedding supply that we can throw in here. It'll help backfill some of these little gaps in here. So I'll be right back. I'm going to head up to the fridge now, and we're going to get some yummy stuff to build that up with. Alright, so here I've got the coffee, 1 day's worth of coffee. I've got an unfortunate package of raspberries that spoiled. I've got some of these, I think they're wax beans, not green beans. I've got some little bits of corn cob, and this one actually has some chunks of corn on it. There's some strawberry in here, and I guess that's about it. But I think that's going to be a pretty nice assortment of foods to throw in here for them, right? So, oops. I'm also thinking, you know, maybe let's hold off here, because I think it wouldn't be a bad idea to dampen this stuff. So I've got my squirt bottle here that we can administer a fair bit of moisture with quite rapidly. I'm not looking to create a big puddle down at the bottom, so I'm thinking it might be also a good idea to start bringing in my shredded paper mix here, which is fortunately right behind me on the ready. So we'll start sprinkling some of this in here. This stuff will probably do a much better job hanging on to the moisture than all that crumpled up newspaper. And I'm just wondering if it might be necessary at some point to come back in here to make sure I supplement the moisture that might have gotten sucked up by that dry newspaper that we put on the bottom and those cardboard tubes. I don't know, might not be necessary. But this stuff here seems like a much better material that's going to catch more of the moisture before it tries to sneak right down to the bottom and create a puddle. So I'll feel better administering a good amount of moisture to this stuff. And then we'll pile the food in and cover up. So I think this is looking pretty nice. I guess we could probably also squash things down, right? Why not? There's a lot of very pliable material in here that easily squashes down. This stuff here I think is going to hang on to moisture really nicely. So we'll be able to come in here real generously with the spray bottle and pile it in. Now we can really dampen stuff here and make it a place where the worms are definitely going to want to hang out and be drawn to. I mean, moisture is one of their favorite things, right? For that matter, they can't really do very well without it, since they do require moisture to breathe. Because they don't have lungs, they're not drawing the oxygen out of the air the way you and I do. They draw the oxygen out of the water content of the material that they're in, right? So I was a little surprised when I heard about that, but then it made complete sense when you think about something that small. It's not inhaling air, it's surviving somehow, but not with the oxygen that it gets from the air. So here too, I'm trying to be pretty careful so as to not spill over the top. But I also don't want to force my little divider wall over too much. I do want to maximize my horizontal migration feeding zone as best I can, but it does seem to me like we're going to be able to level off here at some point when we're nearly done. But why don't we start in now with administering some of the foods that we bought down here for them. I guess we'll start with the beans and the strawberries and the couple chunks of corn cob bits. Yeah, it doesn't seem like much, right? When you start piling in the food, it just seems like perhaps a little bit more up in the kitchen before you bring it down and you try to apply it to this much material. This piece of paper will also work well as just bedding in the end, right? I guess one of the things I also like to pile in once I put the coffee in usually is I like to sprinkle in some of my worm chow. So why don't we bring some of that in here too? We'll do what we can to really entice the worms over here. I know it's not a good idea to pile the worm chow in so thick, but I imagine that I'd be blending it with the surrounding materials. So now it looks pretty decent. And let's not forget about these yummy strawberries. These already have a little bit of mold growing on them. So I think the worms are going to like them, although I don't think that they're too appetizing looking for a typical human, unless you're into that sort of stuff. But who am I to criticize? Okay, I was worried that we're sticking to this little piece of padding that's on the bottom of the container. But luckily it all came out pretty easily. All right, This was actually perhaps a little bit more than I expected it to be, so now I'm starting to feel like we've created a really awesome feeding area for these little guys down in here. All these materials, perhaps not so much the corn, but I think the beans and the berries, I think those things are all going to emit a good amount of moisture as time goes on. So I think we can start winding things down here and getting things leveled off. Once again, I think maybe as a topper, we'll be able to come back in here one more time, but I think we're going to use my squirt bottle. Because with new systems, I'm always a little bit paranoid about the flying insects sensing the delicious foods that are lurking just beneath the surface and trying to come in and make themselves at home. And I guess they can try, but I think the real problem starts when they start laying their eggs and their little babies start hatching, and all of a sudden you got like a little bit of a swarm developing. So I'm going to put my gnat and fruit fly countermeasures in here as the last application of moisture, using this little squirt bottle here. The liquid in here is water combined with those mosquito dunks, which is really just a naturally occurring bacteria. The abbreviated name of it that everyone calls it is BTI bacteria. So it's got some sort of long scientific name that those letters stand for. But I believe that this is the stuff that really saved me when I was starting to have big issues with bugs starting to move into my systems. It just prevents their larvae. So I guess they'll still maybe sense the food and try to move in and lay eggs, but it's those larvae that hatch from those eggs that are going to be able to, well, not be able to, they're not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to develop to the mature stage of flying insects that can mate afterwards. They're going to just be hindered in that stage of their progression, and the whole life cycle will be cut off at that point. Wow, man. I think we really calculated this pretty close. I mean, I suppose we could have maybe created a slightly smaller horizontal migration feeding zone for them over here, in which case we could have possibly come up with a material here that didn't really come up so high within the container. Doesn't matter to me. I think we're in pretty good shape here. So I think this is where we're going to start reusing some of these pieces of the cardboard with which we were covering previously. So I think it's probably a good idea to also cover the feeding zone so as to not let it evaporate and dry too rapidly. So I might actually come back in here with perhaps a piece of plastic if it seems like these coverings are not sufficient to keep the moisture from being lost out of our feeding zone. But maybe doing it this way is going to be adequate. It does seem like a pretty thorough covering. A little bit of ventilation will get by, no problem. The material out here might dry a little bit on the surface, but I think it will also do a good job just on its own, since it is castings, hanging on to its moisture and guarding against evaporation. So here we go, transitioning from everyday composting to what I'm, I guess, not even really treating this as foraging. A lot of times I'll go from composting to just letting the worms run around and forage through the material, break it all down to a nice consistency before I try to migrate them out. But here, I guess here we are. We're just going switcheroo, straight from composting to migration. So I think we're done here. Excellent. I was a little bit nervous about doing this today. I didn't know if I was prepared. I didn't know if it was going to work with the capacity of the containers and the amount of material, but I'm really glad it did. So we're almost done here. I got a few things that I've got to take care of as far as putting things away and cleaning things up, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. That's all boring. Before I go really quick though, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's also very much appreciated. All right, take care everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.